we are all human beings. We've been stuck in traffic and we're just relaxing, and we wanted to do this as a very informal thing. And now we realize it's become much more formal because there are cameras, there are people set up in rows. And I wanted to say something as a tiny little bit of reading from a book, which may make sense in this instance. Architecture, and it's, for those of you who've got a book handy, page 9. Architecture is not a neutral space, since it both constructs us and instructs us. And the site of an exhibition always has a powerful hold over its exhibits and how we view them. The title of the exhibition, Penumbra, refers to the effect of darkness, to an atmosphere created by the scarcity of light, and to the transition from light to darkness. It is Penumbra that sets the physical conditions of the show, while also serving as a metaphor to support its interpretation. The contemporary gallery underscores the triumph of visibility, in which every displayed artifact is evident to the spectator's gaze. As curators of the exhibition, we opted instead to reduce the illumination to the needs of the works themselves. The chiaroscuro effect from Baroque painting, where only the key gestures and actions are brightly lit, while relegating the space beyond to gradual obscurity, provides a leitmotif for the exhibition. The philosopher Gernot Böhme invokes the term atmosphere to describe the complex construction of an event. Atmosphere, he proposes, is what lies between the spectator and the object and stages a tangible feeling. And I think this word feeling is very, very important for us, for Nikki and I. And atmospheres is that supposedly intangible thing that we can't quite touch, we can't quite put our fingers on. Luís Paulo is a painter, an excellent painter, knows this quality, the painterly quality of atmosphere, which is hundreds of years old. And Tatiana, as a cineast, fully understands the importance of the atmosphere in the space of the screen, as a filmmaker, and then in the space of the space in the gallery here. So for Nikki and I, it was really important to try and capture that moment in which, for a very brief period, these works came together in this space. And so the first impression was that we wanted to make a Gesamtkunstwerk, to use Wagner's term, and a term that's very connected, of course, to installation art per se, which is to have various parts subsumed to a whole, in which artworks that are discrete in themselves, for a moment, would become part of a larger play, a moment in time. And that is what an exhibition is. So, in terms of moments of time, I'm going to read two very brief bits because it's important to understand where things come from. And what we tend to do in art is that we jump straight to content. And I think this is the problem. We're not ready for content until we understand, until somebody points away and says, it's that way, it's this way, come with me. And an exhibition, I think, does this. But exhibitions also have a kind of story. And it goes like this. Shuttling between London and Lisbon, we undertook several visits to the studios of Luís Paulo and Tatiana, looking for works to include in the forthcoming exhibition. In Tatiana's case, we also needed to familiarize ourselves with her practice at large, since we had never worked together, contrary to Luís Paulo, with whom we already had a strong working relationship, and who had broached the exhibition to us in the first place, together with Sonia. It is the little things that trap your momentary attention and become lodged in the mind, like the fragment of cloth wafting gently in the breeze in one of Tatiana's films that snags on the barbs of memory. A small, tidy studio in the Curators, a purpose-built atelier complex in Alvalade, betokens a meticulous, carefully calibrated practice. Page 21. The purposefully stacked and laid out works, the pegboards of research images acting as aide-mémoire, the well-ordered nests of films and still files on her Mac, a picture of professional rectitude. Then, all of a sudden, she breaks out into a neat little shimmy, moving her body and arms to an imaginary rhythm as she demonstrates an aspect of another work, a work performed, now performative. Perhaps analogy serves better than explanation, since the gesture remains while the actual content is lost. As in the art of memory, it can be the most insubstantial thing, action, that provokes deep and lasting recall. It is from that moment on that gesture becomes the guiding principle of the show. And maybe this would be an opportune moment to ask Tatiana about maybe some examples of gestures in her work, or the central importance of gesture in your work.
No, I don't even know where to start. It's everywhere. Whoa, that's a big question. Very good question. Very big question. I also have a question for you. Because you called me a cineast, and I'm wondering. Okay, so to answer your question about gesture, when did it become to be important in my practice? I mean, because it's everywhere. I think, but I have to go back to the beginning, to my biography. I did some dance classes when I was still a child, and in terms of my education, I started by studying fashion design at the architecture faculty in Lisbon. And what was interesting for me in fashion was, in the 90s, this was the late 90s, was this performance of the body, how people use the way they dress themselves to express themselves and to perform themselves to others. It's this first kind of gesture of performance that you see in everyday life. Then I decided to go to London and to continue my studies at Central St. Martin's, because I was lacking some more artistic influences, let's say. And then when I arrived to London, I did a foundation studies in art and design, and then I decided to continue studying fine arts. And I think I always have this quest for freedom. And that's also to do with my biography, and I'm not going to go in detail about that, but I think we discussed that in my studio. So within fine arts, when I was studying, I was using photography mainly to document performances that I was doing. So again, a lot of gesture and action. And then photography became more and more a thing of its own. And then I realized, okay, I'm always struggling within these terms, and people here know, and people who know me know this, that I'm always struggling between the terms of photographer, cineast, artist, visual artist. For me, I tend to think of myself as an artist, period, because I think about art, and when I think about art, I don't see the medium as an end in itself, but it's a means to convey, communicate, express, do. I see my work as also action, and the way I think, and the knowledge that can be produced through this exercise, repeated exercise and inscription and practice, is thinking through doing. So, and for me this is very important. I think thinking and producing knowledge is an exercise, also a physical one. So by doing, I'm exercising the way I think. and it's through certain decisions that are translated into actions and gestures. So this is one thing. And then the other thing is the gesture that exists inside the image. For example, the hands that you see so often in my work. And it's not by chance that they are there. They also produce feelings. I mean, the film attests, it's a way for the camera to go inside a subjective space by looking very, very closely into the body. Minuscule gestures, tiny gestures that invigilators make while they're waiting, while they're observing. And then there's
But one of the important aspects of gesture is the question of time. And I think this is so central in the moving image work, because according to Bergson, it is, of course, the key way of suggesting life, of being alive. It's a measure of life. And so somewhere this tension between the moving image that exemplifies gesture and the photography which suggests gesture but never enacts it is very patent in your work.
Yes, and when I'm editing, for example, it's very, very physical, because, this piece is actually set, but usually I work from an image from reality, something that's happening in front of me. But when I'm filming something that's happening in front of me, for example, I need to feel it's easy, sort of easy, to know when to start, because I see it, I see something there, and then I start filming. But the most difficult is to know when to stop. In this, you have to feel in your body. And also when you're editing, and when you're working with sound and rhythm, like this piece, for example, you have to know when to cut. I mean, you not know, but you have to feel. And there are many examples in my work where it's very much, about, very much, that's very much present.
This physicality of the image, be this a moving image or be this a still image, is something that we've discussed quite a lot. And I think it's worth really pointing out, because there is something almost sculptural in this, certainly the way that we've understood it, and certainly spatial as well, as we can see in this exhibition. This exhibition is an atmosphere of gestures in many ways, but importantly, somewhere in the text, we mentioned the films of Daniel Huillier and Jean-Marie Straub, a very famous filmmaker and his editor. And they're also a married couple. And somewhere in here, this goes back to the stories of exhibitions, there was a connection for us when we went to see her studio, in which there was some material, some advertising material from an exhibition or something of the Straubs. And it related to a film called On Jazz o Teu Sorriso, which is a very famous film in Portugal, which had been suggested to us by a different Portuguese artist years ago. And this is all about notions of serendipity. And ultimately, what was happening there is that in this film, On Jazz o Teu Sorriso, that those two people had made, it's a coming together in the cutting room of the husband and wife. And much of the film is about them arguing about things. Now, it should be like this, it should be like that. Then the husband starts to give a lecture to her, and she tells him, just go piss off. And then he pisses off outside, smokes a cigarette, comes back in. It's a beautiful film, because it's not cynical at all. It's about making stuff, the difficulty of shaping stuff. And they're shaping stuff in the process of editing. So, let's just move on for a second to Luís Paulo, and maybe by way of introduction, it goes like this. So we've met Tatiana now in the book. Now, a tall, slight man in hues of black and blue ambles towards us across the crushed white stones of the garden of the small hotel, a man we have not yet met, but are sure we will within the space of a few paces. There is a slight hesitation, a flicker of recognition on his brow, as if approaching strangers with a vague sense that they might be the ones he was looking for. We had no physical likeness we could attach to him, only a name without a face. Perhaps it was the waiting that gave us away, that condition without particular expectation, when you're open to anything. He says our names, with a lift at the end and suggesting a question, not an assertion. Followed by Luís Paulo. We gesture him to sit, and he folds himself neatly into the empty chair at our table, legs intertwined, swiftly lighting a cigarette. A small ritual gesture to signal the beginning of taking time. Not something spent vicariously, wantonly, but doled out with great care, something akin to a gift dedicated to that moment. So, that was our first introduction to Luís Paulo some years ago, and we since worked together on several things. We worked together on a text, we worked together on an exhibition at Cristina Guerra, which we also shared, and his gesture in that moment became very important to us. And he then explained to us, through the exemplification of his painting, what position gesture had in his work, specifically the gesture of his hand as a painter. And he then sent us a text where he explained this. E talvez pudesses falar em português para explicar esta situação.
Sim, eu vou mesmo falar em português.
Sim, senhor, fala em português.
Mas o facto de falar em português não significa que possa ser mais claro a reagir à questão que tu estás a levantar. Porque é muito claro o entendimento que eu faço da importância desse gesto, mesmo que ele não seja intencional. Eu diria que ele está latente, quer dizer, porque na verdade, em alguns momentos, esse gesto pode ter uma expressão mais convincente e mais imediata. Noutros casos, ele pode estar mais, ou pode ter uma presença mais subtil. Mas o gesto que eu estou a querer referir não é o gesto físico inerente à atividade de pintar, porque esse naturalmente existe sempre, não é?
Mas no teu caso é um duplo gesto.
É o gesto da escolha daquilo que tu vais pintar e é um gesto duplo na medida em que essa escolha acaba por ficar acentuada, porque há aqui várias questões que são importantes para mim e no meu trabalho, que tem que ver com a questão da cópia, tem que ver com a questão da réplica, tem que ver com a questão da mimetização, tem que ver com a questão de sentir uma determinada realidade e posicionar essa realidade num momento suspenso de tempo até que seja substituída por uma nova realidade. E todos estes níveis de aproximação e de entendimento intensificam esse lado do gesto, mesmo que isso não seja muito evidente.
There is a particular piece in this exhibition which for us is a key piece, in case you missed it when you saw the exhibition as you were walking around. And it's a painting that Luís Paulo made specifically, site-specifically, for the exhibition. And it's the painting in the room upstairs on the very, very far end. And it's the noisy painting. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this particular painting.
Essa pintura, eu acho que ela primeiro procura responder a um desafio, e o desafio era de alguma maneira, intensificar uma coisa que existe por aí noutras pinturas. Ou seja, a ideia era utilizar como ponto de partida uma imagem para a pintura que, na verdade, fosse uma imagem do próprio lugar onde previsivelmente essa pintura ia ficar instalada durante a exposição. O ponto de partida de facto é esse, é uma imagem que eu trabalho em pintura e é a imagem, portanto, daquele lugar, daquele espaço dentro dentro deste corpo físico que é esta arquitetura e esta galeria, e a pintura declaradamente tinha esse caráter descritivo de espaço de forma muito sumária, muito direta. Uma parede, ao fundo, parcialmente duas paredes laterais, um pouco do teto, um pouco do chão. E esse foi o ponto de partida. E o ponto de partida não corresponde exatamente ao ponto de chegada, daí eu, de alguma forma, procurar que o título venha produzir alguma gravidade em relação àquela pintura do ponto de vista daquilo que ela hipoteticamente representa, porque, na verdade, se olharmos muito rapidamente, eu diria que a pintura não é muito feliz nessa descrição do espaço, porque não é uma descrição direta. Eu diria, depois de sabermos que é o espaço que está representado ali naquela pintura na parede, conseguimos somar as partes e encontrar alguma estabilidade na leitura daquela imagem. Mas isso não é o mais importante. O mais importante para mim, de facto, é que, a partir de um desafio que é muito limitado e muito fechado, foi possível seguir um determinado caminho. Também me surpreendeu no final, quer dizer, porque aquela pintura acabou depois... Tinha um ponto de partida com uma métrica tão apertada, tão limitada, tão pouco interessante, convenhamos. Até do ponto de vista dos desafios da pintura, ela própria, como linguagem. E depois há um momento em que tudo se torna muito mais libertino e muito mais audaz, independentemente do resultado ser feliz ou infeliz. Tudo o que eu estou a dizer tem que ver com o exercício que eu estabeleço no fazer a pintura. E, de facto, era um assunto pouco interessante que se transformou num desafio muito interessante. E surpreendeu-me esse lado de repente da pintura começar a encontrar-se ela própria, e eu só estava a orientá-la, deixando um espaço, diria, grande para eu próprio me surpreender com o resultado final da pintura. Ela está intimamente ligada àquele lugar. Sem aquele lugar e sem o desafio que foi lançado dentro de um regime, diria, mais privado, ela não existia. Agora existe de uma forma emancipada, porque eu acho que ela também não fica completamente presa a esse lugar, mas no contexto desta exposição está completamente presa àquele lugar. E também não é.
And I think it's very interesting the way that there are works. And a painting, we might say, or a photograph, they are fixed in some sense. They are what they are, on the one hand. But on the other hand, they're also not fixed at all. Mm-hmm. But how can we find this out? And the way to find this out is precisely to make an exhibition. Because in an exhibition, in that momentary juxtaposition of things, we find out that the dialogue that the gallery is trying to make has a real place. It becomes real. The dialogue isn't just something invented or people talking. It's actually works speaking with one another to see if they can accommodate each other, to see if they like each other, to see if they hate each other, to see if they must leave the space. There were many pieces of work that left the space because they could not be accommodated. And some things make a temporary accommodation with one another, and the pieces of work afterwards will change once again. One of the pieces that was a really key piece for Nikki and I, straight from the start, and we always wanted this piece, was this particular piece, wasn't it?
Yep.
In the sense that when it's quite a large piece, you may think it's a large space, but when you're curating shows, you'd be surprised how hard it is to actually fit things together. So between his painting on that far wall, which was site specific for the exhibition, and this piece, which had already been shown before, but perhaps Tatiana can tell us the difference of how it was shown and the migration of this piece into this space.
Yes. This is part of, the pieces that you see here are all part of bigger projects and from different periods of my practice and Luís Paulo's practice. This one in particular is part of a series called Bella/Africola, and it started in Berlin when I was doing a residency at the Haus Bethanien in 2016, and I took the photographs, this archive that my aunt has of photographs of her that were taken in Angola in 1975. I had these pictures with me for a long time, and I struggled how I would work with them, and I really wanted to work with them. I tried making a film, and then it didn't work. And then in Berlin, finally, I had the distance, the necessary distance, I think, to approach this subject. So, the first decision I made was to clean the images from the traces of time. So I scanned them, I cleaned them, and then I reprinted them. And I reprinted them in this scale, which is also very physical, like the process of printing. And I showed them, and the support of these images, these large-scale images, were Africola bottles. And Africola is a German drink that was produced in the 30s in Germany as a result of the Second World War and Germany trying to raise itself and trying to, in industrial terms, and sort of boycotting Coca-Cola and American products and having their own beverage. But funny enough, they named it Africola, and then in the 60s there are all these advertising films that are very avant-garde and Dadaist, and this idea of Africa is transported into a kind of totally different realm. The exoticism of Africa in the West, blah blah, which is something that I've worked before. This idea of the exotic with projects like this when I did this series Foreign Grey in 2014. And so what was supporting this image in Berlin was the German drink Africola. So, and then the second moment where I showed this piece was in Lisbon, where we are more familiar with this type of images from Africa and Angola and so on, but we're not so familiar with this drink. So for me, this traveling of objects and how the context changes our perception of them was also very important. And Africola becomes an image as well.
I think that's very much part of the way that this exhibition evolved, because going to your studio and choosing work, talking about the work, and then the work arriving here still goes through that evolution of where will it go, how will it fit. And also there are lots of exhibitions that people can say they've seen that are called things like dialogues or conversations between artists. And I don't know, for me, if I haven't really seen very many that actually deal with that as a subject. They're two single artists who seem to somehow or another end up in a room together. And that began to be something that Nico and I were very, very interested in. And especially when one, certainly with Nico and I, is that our whole experience with artists is that we have to work with them over time. We're very, very clear that we really want to know as much as we possibly can about their practice. And there are other things that come into it, whether one actually feels that you're picking things, because like you said about a gesture, there is something there, there's something that makes you want to feel as though that piece is right. But then you've got the equation of so many other things that you've got to deal with. And then for Nico and I, when we first came into this space, the lighting here was so bright and so wrong, and also it took over anything that we really wanted to feel the work was offering. And we wanted to really take it down as far as we possibly could, but also by using nothing that is too fancy or over the top. We used ordinary light bulbs because we just wanted to have, for me, the sense is also a lot of this work I almost see that we're choosing because we would like to take them home and put them on our walls. So to take away that spotlight, that kind of sense of lighting, and lower everything down, make everyone feel as though they're actually in much more of an intimate environment, even if it is the size of this. And that therefore also realize that there's been a lot of talking, a lot of sense of who we are together, the four of us. And sometimes that's really not easy in an exhibition, and you have to go through a lot of things, and you have to really start to feel as though you're on the edge of something. It's like, is it going to work? Are we working together? Does it even matter in the end if we do work together? But I always felt that it's a really important point where you get to with each other and with the artists that you're working with, that you can feel that there is a sense of direction and people understand what it is they're doing.
I mean, there is always this kind of sense of trust, and emblematically for us, the trust was sorely tested by the lighting levels. Now, obviously, we are now sitting in a space which is entirely artificial and is not connected to the exhibition anymore because we have extra lighting. So something has changed. The exhibition is no longer what it was an hour ago, for obvious reasons. And these cones of light that you see everywhere, this is a completely new system. Everything was dropped down by hand, it's handmade. Each shape for each piece is hand-shaped. They're all completely different, and it's not because we have an inherent artisanal interest in the sculptural shapes that then light, but maybe it's a way that the lights can address the works themselves, because we're used to highly professionalized, very directional lighting that really put artworks in the glare of the spotlight. And maybe, and somebody, a theoretician called David Price, wrote very beautifully in one of our books about the fact that maybe exhibition spaces are also places for artworks to hide. Not just to be exposed, to be espantados, like in the headlights of a car, and the artwork goes, but in fact it's the opposite. Sometimes artworks need to hide. And it's a great shame that we have so much light in this space here now, because here there is very little light. And there are some pieces here, especially the naked girl over there, and the advertising detail next to it, which has actually been described, the yellow one, has been described as an exercise in looking. An exercise in looking, because if you don't look at it, you just think it's yellow. And it's a little bit, in the book we say, it's akin to Bon Jovi and their idea about M&Ms. There were no brown M&Ms allowed anywhere in their post-concert rooms. And everybody thought that this was like a weird quirk that they had about brown M&Ms. There were some serious deficiencies there. They're about the color brown or something. No. They just put it at the last point, as the last point in their contract, to make sure that the people at the concert venues had read the whole contract. So it was a trick. And so here we have the luminous dots on that yellow piece. And it's an exercise in looking. And it ended up next to Naked Girl, and you can barely see the pieces of work. And between all of us, we had lots of discussions about what the light levels should be. And light levels became symbolic for the moment of trust. Because, yes, light levels were lifted up and then dropped down, and lifted up and dropped down. And we argued and discussed about this. And in fact, it was interesting that Luís Paulo, who actually had the most to lose, was actually happy with very little light. And why was that?
Se não tiveres as coisas muito iluminadas, escondes as coisas e, portanto, se as coisas estiverem com erros ou defeitos, passas mais despercebido. É uma vantagem. Eu fiquei confortável para ser muito para ser muito honesto. Eu fiquei muito confortável porque nós, de facto, temos uma relação que se estendeu no tempo. E existe entre nós confiança. Eu tenho admiração pelo vosso trabalho, vocês respeitam o meu trabalho e, na verdade, só numa situação em que eu me sentisse verdadeiramente desconfortável é que eu diria não, it's too much, I don't want this. Isso não aconteceu durante o nosso projeto, até a exposição estar montada. Esta não seria a exposição que eu faria. Mas esta é exatamente a exposição onde eu quero estar e quero estar deste modo. Porque esta exposição, para mim, em termos pessoais, tem duas coisas que eu considero importantes. A primeira é que eu estou a encontrar no espaço da exposição, que é um momento, acaba hoje, estou a encontrar neste espaço com o meu trabalho de uma forma que também é nova para mim. Desde logo nas relações que vocês estabeleceram entre o meu próprio trabalho, nas relações que depois foram estabelecidas entre o meu trabalho e o trabalho da Tatiana, de que eu gosto bastante. E essa condição, para mim, era suficiente para eu criar na minha cabeça esta zona de conforto, que é: o trabalho é meu, parte, o outro é dela, a exposição é nossa, mas é nossa resultando do vosso olhar. E, portanto, eu senti-me muito confortável com essas escolhas todas, com essas opções todas. Nunca senti que o trabalho não estava bem iluminado, porque estou a ver ali que há uma das pinturas da série do Corvo que tem ali uma parte que não apanha luz. Qual é o problema? Eu às vezes também não apanho luz e vou contra as coisas. Isso é tudo normal. A pintura não existe só neste momento, ali. Já existia antes. Esta exposição resulta muito disso. Há duas peças inéditas, creio eu. Há peças que estão aqui mostradas. Eu tenho aqui uma peça de 2004, nunca tinha sido mostrada, e estava na Penumbra, e vocês viram na Penumbra e disseram, esta vai. E depois funcionou e ficou. E essas experiências todas, na verdade, colocaram-me a mim, sendo um dos autores da exposição, numa posição muito privilegiada, que foi, enfim, ser surpreendido dentro da minha própria exposição. Isso é muito feliz, é uma experiência ótima.
There is also a really interesting installational moment that happens in... Every exhibition has details, but since we are sitting in a particular room and it's easier to speak about the things that are actually in this room, there's a really interesting installational moment that happens in this space here. Bella, the piece, as we already said, was always a key piece, and it needed to be not this way, but that way. And Tatiana gave her very particular reasons for that, which is a discussion around landscape as a horizontal shape and portraiture, which is a vertical shape. And this is art historically really, really interesting to follow. And then we have this relationship in this like almost subterranean but almost subaquatic space because of all the wet that's in there. I mean, to me this is like almost a swimming pool. We are underwater in some kind of way. We are immersed, not just immersed in the sense of the word with installation and atmosphere, but also almost sort of in terms of a kind of physical quality. And so there is this kind of floating figure here, and this is very important because of what's actually happening here. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this particular piece and how the space extends into something that already, as Roland Barthes talks about, that has already been.
Right. Just to go a little bit backwards, I'm very sensitive to light. For example, this piece you wouldn't be able to see it if there was too much light. Now, for example, there's too much light and we cannot see it. So this is a scene that I shot in Beijing in 2013 while I was traveling in China. I went there for a commissioned work, but on the condition that they give me a visa to stay for a longer period, and then I stay by myself and I film as I want, and I have the freedom to stay and to discover the city by myself. And then I went to Macau and Hong Kong. In this particular moment, it started raining. I saw what was happening outside. I mean, this beautiful light from the car that was the only not the only, but the main light in this scene, and people crossing the scene, the image, back and forth, and as just shadows, and the way they walk in the rain. Again, this idea of performance. It's the way they walk. Sometimes they walk at the same pace. Sometimes there's children running across. There's a man playing with his umbrella, rotating his umbrella. So many things happen while I'm just filming this street for 8 minutes. It's a loop, and it's entitled "A Few Colored Tears." So it's a metaphor for the rain for many different reasons. Once I was reading the essay on the exotic written by Victor Segalen, where he decides to do a report of his travels in China, but deciding very specifically that he's not going to document or describe any exotic animals or fruits, that he was refusing this idea of the exotic, but a few colored tears may be shed, but that they would soon dry up. So, this is my dialogue with Segalen and the essay on the exotic, and also things that happened with me when I was doing this commission job, where, for example, I was asked to post-produce my photographs, and because the sky was gray in my photographs of Beijing, and they wanted me to turn the sky blue through post-production. So of course, if the sky is colorful, then the rain is also colorful. So
There's something really interesting that one of the things perhaps to say, and I don't know how much time we've got left, but I think I wanted to say a couple of things about reasons why we ought to make books. Not necessarily about art, but around art, for sure. Because there's very little to explain, but so much to discuss, so much to talk around. And as the great writer David Hickey said, the best way to talk about art is to talk about something else. And I think that something else is really, really important. And we've recently been discussing the work of a really important trans writer called Olivia Laing. And Olivia Laing wrote a book called The Lonely City, which describes her loneliness whilst living in New York in a tiny room and being endlessly online at the same time. And there's a particular page which we just came across. And it has a kind of relationship to something here, but not exactly, because nothing ever fits exactly. Otherwise, what would the world come to? And she says this: or alternatively, to put other people in there, the better to enjoy them. All sorts of aspects of his work echo through Harris's projects, as they do through the internet at large. Take the so-called boring films with their gratuitously lingering glances, and they're relating here to Andy Warhol's films, Andy Warhol's quote-unquote boring films. Quotidian activities of their titles, sleep or haircut or kiss or eat. They testify to the desire to watch a body perform its rites, the same urge that is present in a cruder form in these endless recordings of people going about their daily lives, washing, sleeping, having sex, an urge that is itself subsequently has flowered out in vast profusion on the internet, that kingdom of self-portraiture, that enclave of the fetishized and the banal, surveillance art, I suppose you could call it, made before the term was even in circulation. And it strikes me in both your works, perhaps not just this, which is, as you say, the loop that simply records very beautifully, but it records something which happens in front of the camera. The camera does, once set up, does not go looking for it. The world comes to it. And in Warholian terms, with the empire building, for example, we could talk about it as exactly those films in which, quote unquote, nothing happens, which of course is a misunderstanding. But equally, in Luís Paulo's case, the images that he picks from either the internet, that vast store of images, and also his own images that are never set out to be anything but extraordinary, but in fact that are to do with a kind of lack, in a sense, of content. And the content is then added by them being co-opted into the space of art. And to this day, I think for Nicky and I, we think art does something magical. Art transforms something into something else. No matter how conceptual you're going to be, the magic is always this liminal transition that happens as you go across the threshold. And perhaps the last thing to say then is that a book cements this moment of transition and memorializes it to the point afterwards. And why is it that we never make books before the exhibition to accompany the exhibition so that people can walk around the exhibition and look at the books? Because it takes time for all of us to digest the exhibition. They know their work. We're coming to terms with the work. We're together making the exhibition. There's a process. If we don't have a moment to cogitate, to think about it, to reflect, it makes the project very, very hard. So the book for us is always an afterthought. It's the before thought because we're already writing, we're already thinking. Then the exhibition and the work happens. Then visitors come. And then eventually the show is rethought again in this little book, which you should put in your pocket and you should read, because I think a lot of love has gone into it from all of us, and I think not a little bit of magic. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or queries? You don't have to.
No one has questions? No?
Nope.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you.